The ground on which he stood was dry as a bone and hard as a rock. It was dry everywhere. It hadn't rained for over 3 years. King Ahab stood there watching the prophet approach him. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Now, King Ahab was the king of Israel, a nation descended from Abraham, led by Moses, and heirs of a covenant with God, the creator of heaven and earth. God was their God. He chose them to be his people and to worship him alone. But sadly, many of the kings of Israel led their people away from covenant living. Ahab was notorious for his rebellion against Almighty God. For instance, do you remember Joshua and the Battle of Jericho and the walls that came tumbling down? Very good. Do you remember that after Jericho was destroyed, Joshua made a pronouncement against the rebuilding of the city of Jericho? Do you remember that? Joshua said that the person who rebuilds Jericho, the walls of Jericho, will do so at great personal cost. They shouldn't do it. It's cursed by the Lord. The person who rebuilds the walls of Jericho, when they lay the foundation, their oldest son will die. When the gates are hung on the walls of the city of Jericho, their youngest son will die. Now, do you think that the king of Israel, an inheritor of the covenant of God, would find it incumbent upon himself to warn his subjects against such a curse and to stop them from doing such a thing? Not King Ahab. He allowed one of his subjects, a man named Hiel, to rebuild the walls of Jericho, and the pronouncement that Joshua pronounced against the building of the walls of Jericho became fulfilled prophecy. As Hiel's oldest son died, as he laid the foundations of Jericho, but that didn't stop Hiel or Ahab, and his youngest son died at the hanging of the gates of the walls of Jericho. That's the kind of king that Ahab was. He didn't care a whit about the word of the Lord. He sought a wife from a neighboring king who often stood against Israel. Her name was Jezebel, and she was a fanatical worshiper of a god named Baal. God issues a challenge, Elijah said to King Ahab, a public challenge to Jezebel's god. Summon all Israel for this challenge. It will be me representing God versus all the priests and priestesses of Jezebel representing Baal. Now, the worship of Baal was first introduced in Israel as an option for those who weren't comfortable with the jealous, stringent God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And because Baal worship came complete with idols that could be touched and bowed down to and kissed, and rituals that included drunkenness and prostitution, well, you can imagine that Baal worship caught on pretty handily. Asherah, the goddess wife of Baal, also used prostitution and related practices in worship, but went beyond that into something disgustingly murderous. Archaeologists dug up an Asherah temple from the time period of Ahab and Jezebel, and they discovered a graveyard full of small clay jars. Do you know what was in those small clay jars? They found remains of human infants in those small clay jars. Now, Jesus said, if anyone hurts one of these little ones, it would be better for him that a huge heavy stone were fastened to his neck and they were thrown into the depths of the sea. So can you imagine how God felt about Baal worship and how he felt about what it was doing to his people? As the worship of Baal and Asherah caught on, it was clear that coexistence was not the option that the early proponents of Baal insisted that it was. Jezebel began funding her priests with money from the royal treasury, feeding them at her table in a time of famine when the people of Israel were dying of starvation. And she systematically hunted down and killed any prophets of God who were brave enough to show themselves. In the midst of this sinister darkness came the shining light of God shining through the prophet Elijah. The first thing that we see about the prophet Elijah, and this is the first thing on your outline this morning, is that Elijah was devoted. Elijah was apparently devoted to God. He was devoted to God from birth. His name means Yahweh is God. Yahweh, of course, our transliteration of the holy name of God given to the people of Israel, so holy that in its original spelling, it could not be pronounced. It was just That God who is so holy, he is my God. So apparently Elijah's own parents desired for their son to grow up knowing that he belonged to God. And now Elijah's mission was to remind all of Israel that they belonged to God. Now the appointed day came, and the whole nation gathered at Mount Carmel for the showdown. In front of the eyes of virtually all the people stood Elijah on one side and the priests and priestesses of Baal on the other. Elijah was devoted to God's truth, even if the odds were 850 to 1. Elijah stood on the mountain and announced the contest, 2 altars and 2 bulls. The priests and priestesses of Baal were to prepare their sacrifice first and call on the name of Baal. Then Elijah would prepare his sacrifice and call on God. The one who answered with fire from heaven, he was God, and he was to be followed alone by the people of Israel. The people of Israel were so excited about this proposal that they met it with icy silence. No one said a word. Maybe it's because they felt a little guilty about what they had been doing, or maybe because they were really happy with the way that things were going. Or maybe they were afraid to say anything at all. So they didn't. But Elijah was unashamed. He was unashamed to represent the Lord his God, the great God of Israel, for whom he was named. So he said, "Play ball." Ahab began to grin. Surely this will be no problem for Baal. Okay, well, he hadn't brought rain for the last 3 years, but surely a little fire, a little lightning, something to ignite this dry ground, well, it shouldn't be too hard for the storm god. After all, this contest was on Mount Carmel, a mountain revered to be the sacred dwelling place of Baal. No amplification was needed. Baal was right there. As the priests of Baal went about preparing the sacrifice, Elijah and the rest of Israel looked on. Now Elijah had seen the power of God continually since the rain stopped. As we talked with the children, God sent Elijah to a remote area where there was a brook and fed him twice a day with ravens. When the brook dried up, God led him to a town named Zarephath. Now, Zarephath was near the hometown of Baal and the hometown of Jezebel's dad, the king of Sidon. So right under Baal's nose, Elijah the prophet is led, and he's led to a widow who was sure that she and her son were about to starve to death. Following Elijah's orders, the woman made a small cake of bread for Elijah, and then for her son and herself, using what she was sure was the last of the flour and the oil that she had been able to preserve. Except God did not allow the flour and the oil to run out from that day until the end of the famine. There was always enough for the widow and her son and for Elijah. Now, Elijah was back on home turf in Israel, unashamed to call Israel to make a decision about God, the God to whom he had devoted his life. Along the way, God used the ravens and the widow to teach Elijah a lesson, that Elijah was dependent. Elijah was dependent on God to provide needs and overcome weakness. And Elijah saw that God provided for all his physical needs, and then some. Now the priests and priestesses of Baal had prepared their sacrifice. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they began chanting and praying to Baal. At about noon, they became a little more intense, and they began dancing before Baal, likely starting out with some of the seductive dancing that caused Israel to fall in love with Baal worship. But when that seemed to be of no avail, they began leaping and screaming. Elijah couldn't stand it any longer. He began to taunt them. "Hey, priests of Baal, he can't hear you. Hey, do you suppose he's indisposed at the moment?
The party you are trying to reach is not available. Please leave your message at the tone.
Beep. Or how about, maybe he's gone on a trip? I mean, Baal was known to be a cruiser with the sailors out on the Mediterranean Sea, and it hadn't rained here for 1,277 days. He's probably out somewhere where the weather's a little nicer. Or maybe he's asleep. Shout louder! And so they shouted louder. They did everything they could do. They even got out knives and began to slash themselves, anything to get the attention of Baal. But 1 Kings 18:29 says, there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Can your God save you? Does it really matter what God you believe in? In the day of distress, when it really counts, can your God step in and save the day? Well, Elijah waited until they were finished. It was about 3 in the afternoon. 9 to 3 is a little long for a church service. But then in the presence of everyone there, he repaired an old altar on Mount Carmel that was used for the worship of God. He gathered 12 stones, one stone representing each of the tribes of Israel, and by extension, it represented every man, woman, boy, and girl who was watching this contest. And on top of the repaired altar, Elijah placed the bull offering that God had prescribed. And then Elijah dug a trench around the altar and did something really different. He called for water. It hadn't rained for 3.5 years, and this dude wants some water? Well, before we get too worked up, Mount Carmel was a seaside mountain on the Mediterranean Sea. And although, salt water isn't drinkable, it is pourable. So that's probably where they got the water. But it was about 8 gallons of water that they drug up to wherever the sacrifice was from the sea, and they poured it over the sacrifice. And then in the eyes of a thirsty nation, Elijah did it 2 more times. By the time he was done pouring water, the ground around the altar had been saturated, and the water filled up the small trench that Elijah had dug around the altar. And Elijah stepped forward at the time of the evening sacrifice, about 6 o'clock, and he prayed this prayer that we read in 1 Kings 18:36 and 37. O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God, and I am your servant, and have done all this at your command. Answer me so that these people will know that you are God, the Holy Lord, and that you are turning their hearts back to you." And do you know what happened? Fire fell. It came down from heaven. It not only consumed the sacrifice and the altar, but it lapped up the water in the trench too. Elijah, representing God, won a great victory that day. The prophets of Baal were run off and eliminated by the people, and Elijah told Ahab to go home because rain was coming. And you know what happened? The rain didn't come. And Elijah learned how God could not only provide for Elijah's needs, but also help Elijah in weakness. Instead of standing on the mountain and thundering forth the word of the Lord, or at least taking an offering, Elijah, that was a laugh line, but never mind. Elijah runs up to the top of the mountain and puts his face between his knees. What was he doing? Well, James, you knew I'd get to James eventually, right? James tells us that he was praying. Elijah couldn't bear to look, but he kept praying, believing that what God had told him would be reality. But Elijah's posture speaks of a couple of things. Fear, maybe, and authenticity, that Elijah was just who he was. How many of you, after you've stood up for something you believe in, feel like you need to run and hide for a while? I know I do sometimes. Secondly, this posture is one of humility. Even after this victory, Elijah wasn't going to presuppose God's next move. So whether we want to admit it or not, we are dependent on God. Maybe we need to be who we are instead of who we think we are. A little time with our face between our knees in prayer probably wouldn't hurt us. And then we can learn what Elijah learned. He was devoted, unashamed, dependent, and Elijah was never alone. God was with him. Not only was God with him, but other believers were wanting to stand with Elijah. In chapter 19, Elijah despairs of his life and says he's the only one of God's prophets left. And God says, I've reserved to myself 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed down to Baal or kissed one of his idols. Well, Elijah kept his head between his knees and sent a servant to check on the weather 7 times. 6 times the servant came back to say that there was not a cloud in the sky. Now picture this. Elijah is up there on the mountain with his face between his knees, and King Ahab is about to mount his chariot and go home when he realizes something. I am going to be in a heap of big trouble when I go back to Jezebel and tell her that we're all God worshipers now, that her buds, the priests of Baal, have all been killed because Elijah said it was going to rain, and there's no rain. Jezebel is going to be so... I better make sure it's raining before I come home. And then it begins to dawn on King Ahab that, Elijah claims to be a prophet of God. Well, according to God's own rules, if a prophet of God is wrong about something, Ahab had every right to kill him. And wouldn't that be justice for what he'd done to Jezebel's priests? So, no rain in the sky. Elijah's on the top of the mountain with his face between his knees, and Ahab is down there waiting. See what's going to happen. The servant comes back the 7th time and says, there's a small cloud over the sea, as small as a man's hand. Tell Ahab what you saw, Elijah said. It really is going to rain. And then the rain came. So I need to wrap this up, and I'd like to give you 3 points in application. James says, as Dan just read, that Elijah was human, just like us. Other translations say that his nature was like our nature, and his passions and temper were like ours. Sure. The prophet who stood up to King Ahab and turned back Israel from worshiping Baal. Yeah, I'm just like that. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The prophet that was so tight with God that when it was time for him to die, God came down with a fiery chariot and took him up to heaven. Oh, yeah, I'm just like that, baby. Sure. James is clear. Elijah was just as human as we are. He had a temper. He likely gave in to temptation. He was susceptible to emotional distress. And if there would have been pants back then, he would have put them on one leg at a time. Nothing special about Elijah. According to James, he was just a regular guy. God can use regular guys. This is in general. This is men and women, okay? God can use regular guys to do amazing things through prayer. God can use regular guys to bring people back to the truth. I love the parallel between Elijah's prayer and James's encouragement. Elijah prayed, Lord, let them know that you are turning the hearts of these people back to you. And James says that if anyone wanders from the truth, and the one who turns them back onto the truth will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. So what would happen in your life and the world around you if you were devoted to God? What would happen in your life and the world around you if you were unashamed to stand for him? What would happen in your life and the world around you if you lived a life dependent on the provision and strength that God alone can give? And what would happen in your life and the world around you if you lived out the reality that you are never alone, nor were you called to live your faith in isolation? What can God use you to do? In James 5:16, we read, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Let's live what we say we believe. Amen.